Welcome to Liner Notes, a podcast about how scholars plan and stay organized in the tools they use. In each episode, I interview a scholar about what's in their pen case, or something akin to a pen case if they don't have one, how they plan their time, and their secrets to an organized scholarly life. I'm Catherine Rye Jewell, a historian and professor of history at Fitchburg State University in Massachusetts. And this is the last episode of this mixtape. I planned this podcast with the idea that it would be a limited series, and the concept of a mixtape is what I used to organize it. I had even filled out a little mixtape, and I'm going to add all of the tracks on here. And it's going to exist as its own collection and a playlist on YouTube. Now, I hope that there will be future mixtapes. They might continue in this theme, or they might have a completely different one. We have to wait and see. But I am a production company of one, and producing a podcast, especially a video podcast, is a lot of work. I have 3 kids, a 4, and a book due in June. So this is it for now, but I do have a few special episodes in the works, including an upcoming one with Zachary Schrag, who's going to think some meta ways about historical research and academic writing with us. But last but not least, today we have Karen Cox, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where she teaches courses in American history with a focus on Southern history and culture. She's the author of Dixie's Daughters, The United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the Preservation of Confederate Culture, which won the Southern Association for Women Historians Julius Cherry Spruill Prize. She also is the author of Dreaming of Dixie, How the South Was Created in American Popular Culture, and Goat Castle, A True Story of Murder, Race, and the Gothic South. She's the editor of Destination Dixie, Tourism and Southern History. And most recently, her book, No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice, was just published with University of North Carolina Press. Her next project will examine the Rhythm Club fire in Natchez, Mississippi, in which more than 200 members of the African American community perished in April 1940. Thanks for watching. Welcome, Karen.
Hey, it's so nice to be here with you.
So for segment 1, I am wondering what is in your pen case, if you have one.
Just such a cool question because it makes me think about when I was in first grade. When I went to school, they hooked me up with one of my grandfather's cigar boxes. That was what you put all your pens and stuff in when you went to school. But okay, so I really don't have a particular pen that I like to use. I have like this whole cup full of pens and highlighters and stuff. And so I think it depends on the pen and how it feels, right? How it feels in your hand. So, I just got one from an attorney's office. So, and it writes so smooth. And I was like, because it was meant for signing documents. So I was like, oh, this would be a good one for signing books. So that's a good one. And then, but then there's others that I feel like more like a ballpoint I like for writing on photocopies of documents that I might have, so where I can underline. It feels more purposeful to me. It's just and I feel it, like I feel myself thinking as I'm marking and writing and
Highlighting those parts of the document, having a conversation with the document, but
yeah. So highlighters, sometimes, it's interesting because I might do that. It depends on where I am in the process of using a document. I might look at a document 3 or 4 times. So maybe the first time just read it, and then the second time I might underline a couple of things. Another time I might highlight, and then when I get to the point where I'm probably going to write something, I just write in the margins of the document. I mean, the photocopy. No, think I'm writing on the original document, but I write in the margins about maybe a keyword, just to prompt me. To think about where this particular thing fits in. It might fit in more than one chapter. Now, I know there are all these programs out there, and I have used, for example, Microsoft OneNote or something, to divide things into chapters. And then I like it that because it's searchable. But I'm still, probably not a role model where it comes to keeping
I mean,
organized.
I use those. Like I'll put the documents into them and I'll tag them and I'll say like I think this will go with this topic or this chapter. But then I still print them
Yeah,
out and write all over them. And then the
yeah,
highlighting is usually when I go to write, like I'll have a stack of documents that are all kind of related, but then I'll go and actually highlight the
yeah,
ones I want to use or like this part of it.
yeah, yeah. So it just depends on what it feels like when I get to that point. I want to feel like I've probably looked at a document probably 3 or 4 times before I, end up using it or, thinking about how I might use it. I don't know. Yeah, it is like a conversation with the document, I think. I think that's a good way of
Yeah.
describing
And then
it.
the different pens are sort of like the different layers of that
Mhm.
conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, going into the archive, I'm about like being as efficient as possible, right? Some place archives you can make photocopies. Other archives, I'm all about the apps. I use TurboScan. I love it because it takes excellent photos, but it's also you can send it to yourself as a PDF. And I like that. And then, and so I can do that really quickly when I'm in the archive,
Hmm.
right? And then when I get back, then I'm like, okay, then I start to put it into some sort of storage place like Dropbox. And some people, use Google Docs or whatever. But I want to get those things stored, and then those for the primary
Yeah.
search research kinds of documents. But I find it that the app is great because it's amazing how clear they are. You can like zoom in on stuff. You can, like I said, you can send it as a JPEG or you can send it as, a PDF. I just
Hmm.
love
It kind
it.
of cuts the
So
noise
I
out
think
of
it's
the
great.
image too. I find it makes it easier to read.
Yeah, makes it more efficient. Like my time in an archive, much more efficient.
Mhm.
But as we know, like every place is different. Some won't let you do
Right.
that. They won't let you take, even if you don't have a flash on, you can't take it. Or they charge you to take an
Yeah.
image.
Or they have to
Um,
review it
so
before you take the image, or it becomes like a multi-step process. So it's easier to
yeah,
just take notes on it
yeah,
than like have somebody clear it before you take the picture.
right. Which is why I really love working in a small town like Natchez, Mississippi. And they're like, just like, yeah, go ahead and do whatever. And they aren't like, they're not charging me anything, or if I need photocopies, they just let me photocopy and they're not charging me for it. But I mean, obviously that's not the case everywhere. You can't get away with that at the National
Yeah.
Archives. You have to you have to fill out the right
Yeah.
material,
List each
um,
one that you take.
yeah,
Do you have any
absolutely.
naming
But
conventions for your this is where I always run into trouble is in, I end up going with like whatever the stock name is, or like I'll name some of them and not others, and then they're out of order. Like, do you have a process for doing that?
yeah, so that would depend. So I was in Chicago, and I was looking through the field notes of this sociologist, and who was one of the co-authors of this anthropological study called Deep South, Studying Caste and Class, came out in 1941. Turns out it's about Natchez, Mississippi, and it was, oh god, it was so cool. Anyway, I was nerding out when I saw it, because like in the book it's all uh, they changed the names of people. In the field notes it's the people's names. So anyway, so I might take some images of a section of the notebook, and it was, let's say it was about Jewish life or something like that. So that's how I might do it. I'm like Davis Papers Jewish life, or something like that, or Davis Journal, Black Baptist, whatever the section of that journal was about. And so I might do that. When I was at the National Archives, I was looking at some Red Cross records, and it just depends on how, I can get a whole document. I can make an entire PDF of like this, an entire document, and I might just say what it is. I mean, just call it what it is. You know. So I guess it just depends, And then now when I'm organizing, say, and this is where I'm at right now with a project. I've got several African American newspapers that offered coverage of this event that I'm writing about, which is the fire, and I'm right now I'm thinking, okay, how do I organize that? I could organize it by the paper, Chicago Defender, New York Amsterdam News, Pittsburgh Courier, whatever. Then I was thinking, oh, but wait a minute. Like, I'm thinking, I want to kind of follow the story as it comes out. So maybe really like the better organizing framework would be by date, but under African American newspapers. So I will say, okay, April 30th, May 1st, May 2nd, May 3rd, and then have all the papers from the different ones. But when I was just collecting them, just to put in Dropbox, it all went into African American newspapers. Because I did want to distinguish between their coverage and white coverage of an event in the life of Black people. So that's how I organized it in Dropbox. Now, when I print these things out, then I'm going to organize them. I'll still keep African American newspapers together, but I might organize within that structure by date, because that's kind of the way they reported on it. So it's different, depends on where they are, where the records are. But I want to know, like, I really want to know African American voices versus the white press, because it's such a stark contrast.
It's always hard to know exactly, like there's how the archive is organized. And, sometimes that works very well with the way that you're using the papers, and you just almost replicate that structure in the finding aid. You'll be able to find exactly what you need within that. And then at other places, like what you're coming in looking for is a total mismatch with how that person's papers are organized. And so you have to like change up your system. And
in anticipation, I bought 3-ring binders. There's 4 here. I don't know. I need all these, but I want to put the newspapers in that order that I was saying, because while I'll use digital tools like TurboScan, Dropbox, whatever, I need to like touch the paper. I need to see the page to do the other things we were talking about, to write on it, to think about it. What does this say here?
Yeah. I get to a point in a project where it's almost like I'm doing arts and crafts, because like I've printed stuff out, or I'll have notes. And I'll like cut up the articles and like paste them like in an order, like how I want to write, even like if it's like a little clip and I'm like, want this one to go with this one. And like I get the glue stick out.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's going to be some that seem like they're having that whether or not they were actually having a conversation, they sort of are, in the way, at least the way you think about it. It's like what, the God, I can't think of the black name of the black newspaper in Oklahoma. Anyway, much more radical in its like description of events, and than even the Chicago Defender. But the Chicago Defender had people on the ground interviewing people, right? So I know we haven't discussed. I'm just talking about a project I have not described to you.
Can you tell us just a little bit about?
Just a little, so that you understand when I keep saying the fire and Natchez and black newspapers. So real simply, on April 23rd, 1940, there was a terrible club fire in the town of Natchez, Mississippi, and it is still regarded as the 4th deadliest club fire in the history of the United States. what makes it unique is that all of the victims were African American. The estimate is 209 people were perished in that fire. I think I found at least upwards of closer to 250. It just, it made national headlines. Of course, African American newspapers like the Chicago Defender were really like invested in it because it was in Mississippi, and most Mississippians that were part of the Great Migration had gone to Chicago, as opposed to Harlem or whatever. That it was big news in Chicago. There had been a band from Chicago that was playing that night, and there there were in Chicago there were these black social clubs that were named for the town they're from. So they had the Natchez Social and Civic Club. So they were invested in what was happening back home, So the book is about this fire. It's about race, and it's about jazz, and it's about blues, because there were several blues songs written afterward. It's also about a literary tradition that, like Richard Wright, who was from that area, he actually visited a couple of months after the fire and visited his father and uncles in Adams County, and he ended up writing a novel called The Long Dream. It was one of the last of his novels, but at the center of the story is this club fire that it takes details that are just right out of what happened in 1940, even though the book wasn't published until 58. Mm-hmm. So there's all these, like, it's just so many layers to it. That's why I'm so excited about it.
It reaches back, it reaches forward.
Yeah, and it takes in, it thinks, about there's, the whole racial dynamics in a town like Natchez, where people who are African American could be as fair as you or I am, and they're cousins with white people. It's like there are, it's kind of well known that they are all related in some way to some planter from way back when. So there's the racial dynamics of it, and then the Jim Crow period in this sort of, and then there's I've got a lot of I did all the research before I was called upon to write the book on Confederate monuments. So I had to put that aside. I'm so, and then, even when I start talking about this other book, I get real excited because that's the book I want to write next.
I know. I'm already so excited just thinking about, the way that it plays with space and time and region and closeness and distance.
Oh, yeah.
And
the reason all these people died was because of, there really weren't any, it's really no fire chief in town that was, implementing this, basic requirements. So the club owner was like, oh, he didn't want people sneaking into the club, so he boarded up all the exits except for the front door, and the front doors open inward instead of outward, and people were basically cooked in there. It was awful. It was just awful. And so while people were willing to say that certainly this, and I'm saying from the African American community, we're certainly willing to say this man did a bad thing, right? But there were no real fire codes, right? And so nothing that would have kept him in line and prevented him from doing that. So the way the larger black community saw what happened in Natchez was that Jim Crow killed these people because you don't care about black lives. And so that was sort of the issue there, and the way in which it was covered. And one of the things I found that was just like absolutely fascinating was that I thought I was promoting my book Goat Castle, which was about that town, and I was at the Mississippi Book Festival, and I went to the archives. I thought, let me just see what the archive has, and so there was this file that said, Mississippi River Collection. It was like a WPA thing. And I was like, I'm probably just going to find news clippings that I've seen 100 times. I opened that file, and in it were WPA interviews with people who were survivors or related to the people who had died in
Oh
the
my.
club. There were like 25 interviews. Ministers, funeral home directors, people who had lost children. I mean, it was just like,
Oh my goodness. I mean, that.
that's a whole file by itself. In my a 3-ring binder over here by itself. But it's just like, oh, it's so fascinating because it has all the problems of a WPA interview,
Mm-hmm.
white person interviewing black people, and they're like hesitant about wanting even to talk to them. And even one of the interviewers says she doesn't like trust me, you know, she doesn't want to talk to me about things. And it took a long time. And so, but the questions are so full of stereotypes. What were you drinking? Beer, corn liquor, or bubba that night? What difference does it make? So the only options were beer, corn liquor, and I don't know, wine or something like that. And one of the people responded, Coca Cola. And they ask about questions about superstition.
Just
Ugh, you know,
leading and
that
loaded as.
it's so loaded, and so it was great to find those nonetheless because there are descriptions from what was going on inside the club at the
Yeah.
moment that the fire was going and people were clawing each other to get out
Yeah.
of there.
This is sort of an interesting transition to segment two, which is about organizing time. And when you have, kind of serendipitous finds and, the two different projects and one presenting them and you're teaching and how do you organize all of that? How do you go about thinking about one project while launching another? And like, what is your approach to managing all of this?
Oh my God. Like I said, I had just literally like wrapped up the research for the Rhythm Club Fire book. So excited, ready to jump in. And then here comes UNC Press. Because I had written an op-ed on the 2-year anniversary of Charlottesville for the New York Times, and they were like, oh, John Shearer at the Press is like, told Brandon, you got to talk her into this because this is like seems like an outline for a book or whatever. Okay, so this is not about organizing, it's about why I decided to do it, because I really was kind of sick of that and I really wanted to do this other project. But I was willing to go ahead and do this because, one, I wanted to be the person to do it. I also think it's important that I, as a white southern woman, I mean, I think white Southerners need to speak up about the issue and call it what it is. I feel it's really important, especially when you go to speak to groups in the South. Is just like, let me just like disarm them right off the bat by saying, I'm not some liberal from up north who's coming down south to tell you how to do things here. It's like that's their position. It's they're ready to like pounce on that. And they can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in the region. Once I just said I was going to do it, then I was in. I kind of knew when he said, I said, I'll think about it. And I went and looked in the mirror at myself and was like, you're going to do this, right? But like I said, the way it evolved, it was like, well, I knew I wasn't going to, I think the stuff I was so sick of talking about was really just about the Jim Crow era. Mm-hmm. That's the work that I had done and had continued to talk about. But I knew, like, in writing op-eds, I was like already starting to branch out from that by thinking about how is this relevant to our own time. So I was starting to do some of that anyway. Mm-hmm. But I really, and like I said, once I started following the story of Confederate monuments, and I did that by reading newspapers.com, to be honest, because it kind of almost lays it out for you in a way. It's like, oh, this is what they were talking about in the 50s, and then when we get to the 60s, they're talking about this, and when we're in the 70s, it's something completely different, So I could follow along with these stories, and I realized what was happening. And then then it became, a different book for me, and one that I found honestly more enjoyable. I do feel like, I think I also feel like a responsibility to write it. Not just I'm a historian, I got this contract, I'm going to write this book, but I like a real responsibility to the subject matter. This the best way I can in the most accessible way I can so anybody can
Mm-hmm.
get it. Anybody can pick up the book and read it and understand it. Doesn't mean I you know, shortchange them on scholarship. That's all in there, but I want people to understand what's happening. And the thing that's most powerful is when you use the people's words, the people who put the monument up, or the people who defend a monument, when you use their words, there's no misunderstanding racism and white supremacy. There's no misunderstanding
Mm-hmm.
that. This is not my interpretation. They said it. And they keep saying it. They'll say it in public forums. I was just talking to a reporter from the Houston Chronicle the other day, and they were talking about renaming a school that was named Robert E. Lee. I don't know, elementary, junior high, whatever. And she said there was a woman in the audience during these public forums and said, "Well, we wouldn't be having this kind of conversation if you people would just take care of your own problems in your community," referring to Black people. Like, don't you shouldn't be worrying about the name of the school. You should be worrying about more important things that are affecting your community. See, it's like us versus them, right? She said, I couldn't believe somebody was saying that. People have been doing this in public forums. I could point to, a case in the 1980s in Shreveport, Louisiana, where they were publicly saying those things. They would deflect from the issue that was brought to them about what that monument meant to them and how that affected their community. And it gets turned around and they'll say these things, which is just so full of racism. And it's like they don't even understand the systemic racism that leads to things like, incarceration and absent fathers or whatever these things are. It's like, but they still do it.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of just laying, they might not be using the N word, but they're laying out their racism for everybody to hear. I'm not so concerned about the blowback for me personally. I ask for security when I need it, if I have to go in and speak. Which there's a place I'm going to a couple places in Virginia in the fall. I have asked for security because people will just show up and be nasty. The way people generally have responded is to write me nasty emails using burner accounts, or there's a local woman here in Charlotte who's written a whole op-ed, I guess, for a really conservative paper about me and the just saying just some of the most ridiculous things. And another woman made up some meme. I don't know. It's more like a flyer where she, calling me an anti-Confederate historian and things like that. I get stuff like that, which doesn't really bother me so much. I mean, one of the things that's been going on since the Charleston Massacre is the ebb and flow of this issue. First of all, African Americans have always had been critical of these monuments in their communities, but the Charleston Massacre really took us into a new territory. It made it Confederate symbols national conversation, not just a regional one, but a national one. It's often accompanied by racial violence of some sort, or violence generally. But yeah, you go from Charleston. 2 years later, we have Charlottesville, and somebody gets mowed down and killed for peacefully protesting. But there was lots of back and forth fighting and violence during the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. And you saw that. To me, that really set me. I was like, that is something different right there.
Mm-hmm.
when I saw it. That's why, and that actually is what led me to write op-eds. When Charlottesville happened, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times and the Washington Post in the same
Mm-hmm.
week. And that, like, then that's when I lost, my life was given over to discussing the UDC and monuments and all of that stuff. And then 2 years, what was it, 3 years later is the George Floyd moment, right? Last summer. Again, an act of racial violence that set off, protest against Confederate monuments. And this is the thing, people are like, why does some guy getting killed in Minneapolis have anything to do with Confederate monuments? And it's like, it's because these things symbolize systemic racism, white supremacy, and police brutality that is born from those two things, the racism and the white supremacy. I've like my presentation on this subject has changed considerably in the last few years. Like I'm not mincing words. I might have done a presentation on the UDC several years ago, whatever, and I would talk about monuments a certain way. Give basically the outline of the sort of the history and the like phases of monument building. I'd do that. Not now is much more intentional.
When we're thinking about like, yeah, our time and our organizational strategies, there seems to be just a lot of kind of structuring that you do about your thinking about like you have to kind of compartmentalize certain interactions, things that are coming into your email. I guess well, maybe this is sort of leads into segment 3, which is like a secret to organizing your scholarly life. You got a lot of things coming from different directions.
It can be overwhelming sometimes, right? Because I do teach. Last spring, right, when the pandemic hit, I was teaching a course on Confederate monuments and memory for the very first time ever. I'd never taught one. I wasn't even sure how it would go, and it went like beautifully. The students wrote great papers, even though we had to stop meeting. So that helped. I was allowed to teach a course related to the book I was writing. Not gonna lie, that helped me with that and the organization of that. Like I said, I had to put the one book on the back burner. I just couldn't deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
This summer will free up some time for me to think about this other project. So I think it is just like, also I'm like director of public history again. Like what?
Administrative duties.
This is not, I'm like, because, we're hoping to hire a person in the fall, but part of that's like negotiating. I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I just like, I want to, a course
Mm-hmm.
release. Part of this is about being a more mature individual. I've been doing this a while, and I'm just going to say, hey, I need the time. This is what I want. I mean, I feel like my scholarly life is really, really critically important to me. This is really what I want to do, and so but if you're part of a history department, you can't like shirk your service
Mm-hmm.
duties or not do the things that you need to do. So I do those, but I try to manage that. It's like I don't let it consume me. I think about how I want, to spend my day. One of the things I'm doing, again, because I'm more senior, is and I know we need to do things like review articles and stuff and review books, but I'm not doing as much of that. Those things take a lot of time. I think when you're more junior, you do those things to kind of build up your CV. I don't need to build up my CV at this point. I want to write the books I want to write. So I don't take on as many like book reviews or manuscript reviews. I will do some. I'm not going to say I don't do any. And I don't say yes to everything. Please do not say yes to everything, right? If you are going to review a book that you already want to read. I think it's about like respecting your own time and not saying yes to everything and to say this is what that's the other thing. Do what brings you
Mm-hmm.
joy. It brings me joy to work on a history project. Like I said, you don't want to shirk service duties when your department because you don't want to be that
Mm-hmm.
colleague. but be mindful of what it is you do commit to, because the thing that like I found particularly in the last few years, and maybe this is because I've gotten to this point in my career, it's like I want to do what brings me joy. I don't want to be caught up in the departmental politics or the university politics or whatever, I don't want to get into some like Twitter battle with anybody. That's just such a waste of time. I recognize that I'm in a position of privilege as both a white person generally, but also that I have a tenure track position. I'm full professor, but I've been full professor for a while now. And I recognize that I'm in a position of privilege and have the freedom to think about these things. Right. It's true too that the university as an entity has changed a lot since I started grad school back in that time. But and it seems so much more corporate, which is probably why I focus on what brings me joy, which is the projects that I'm working on, or working with grad students who I see, I recognize have talent. I want to nurture that. I want to be a mentor to other to my colleagues, junior colleagues in the field who aren't at my university. I want to do those kinds of things. I say that I come from a place of privilege. Yes, I get that, but I also didn't grow up privileged. I was, my parents were divorced when I was 6 years old. I had free lunches in school. I grew up pretty poor. I busted my ass, to get what I have. I still have college loans at this point in my career because of those, mafia-like interest rates. I just want to say it's like everything is not all wine and roses all the time. It's like, God, man, it's like I wish I wasn't paying that big hefty payment every month and still not digging out. I know that this is way off of the writing part, but I think that to me, this like the writing, this is what the research and the writing. I love a research trip. I love a research trip. I love going someplace. I'm so excited and, to get into an archive or whatever. If I have to wear gloves, all the better.
I get my little locker with my key.
Yes, exactly. I love all that stuff. That's all part of it, and in terms of like the writing is hard. The writing is hard. I tell my students it is not an easy thing, but like some days you'll go, man, what a great paragraph or what a great sentence today. Like I'll get excited about a turn of phrase. It's just, that's the kind of nerd that I am. But
I hear you.
But I have a question for you.
Okay.
You're a good interviewer, by the way, I think. So why did you decide to do it this way instead of a podcast?
Well, I felt like it was a very visual idea of like people holding up their pens. I think we've also all gotten a little more used to being on camera in the last year.
I would say yes,
and
true.
So I felt like people would probably be more comfortable, and so I do release it as an audio as well. So I also wanted to kind of give people those different modes of engagement. The more the merrier was sort of my approach. But thank you so much for doing this, Karen. This has been amazing.
Oh, it was so much fun. It was just a great conversation. It's like, I think you have something here. I really do. And I hope you'll continue doing it. And who knows? You'll kind of be like the Terry Gross of historians.
Well, I don't think I could have asked for a nicer compliment to round out this mixtape of liner notes. I want to thank all of my guests who generously gave their time and their tips and their strategies for what is a very personal thing. And I hope that I have inspired some people to go out and find their own systems and what works for them, and maybe some new pens. Thank you so much.